Blind people shouldn't live in high-end communities. The words were never said outright, but Henry Lawson could hear them in every sneer, every whispered conversation, and most importantly, in every HOA violation notice that showed up at his doorstep. In the heart of Phoenix, Arizona, the Silver Pines community was known for its pristine lawns, uniform white fences, and strict homeowners association. And at the helm of it all was Veronica Blake, a ruthless HOA president who ran the neighborhood like a dictatorship. She had an obsession with maintaining property values, a thinly veiled excuse for pushing out anyone who didn't fit her perfect suburban mold. Henry, a 35-year-old former federal judge, had lost his sight in a tragic car accident 2 years prior. Struggling to regain his independence, he moved in with his younger sister Emily, who installed a wheelchair ramp, handrails, and a voice-assisted security system to help him navigate their home. To any reasonable person, these were minor adjustments. To Veronica, it was an aesthetic nightmare. Within a week of moving in, Henry received his first violation notice. The second one came when Emily's guide dog Max was deemed too large for HOA pet restrictions. The third, fourth, and fifth followed soon after, each one more absurd than the last. But what Henry didn't realize was that Veronica wasn't just trying to find him into compliance. She was planning to remove him entirely. Veronica Blake wasn't just an HOA president. She was a tyrant in designer heels. And if you think a few unfair violation notices were bad, just wait until you hear what she did next. If this story has you hooked so far, comment HOA Nightmare below and hit subscribe, because trust me, you won't believe what happens next. Henry and Emily had tried to ignore her harassment. They paid the ridiculous fines, repainted the mailbox twice to match the exact shade of Silver Pines classic white, and even trimmed their already immaculate hedges. But nothing was ever good enough for Veronica. She wanted Henry gone. One evening, just as the sun dipped below the Arizona skyline, Emily caught Veronica sneaking around their house, flashlight in hand, measuring tape stretched across their wheelchair ramp. When confronted, Veronica didn't even flinch. "Just ensuring compliance, dear," she said with a smile that didn't reach her cold, calculating eyes. That's when Emily knew. This wasn't just about petty HOA rules. This was personal. The very next morning, Henry received a final notice of eviction, citing excessive non-compliance with HOA regulations. But here's where things take a dark and illegal turn. The eviction order wasn't signed by a judge. It was forged. Yes, you heard that right. Veronica had faked legal documents to give herself the power to seize their home. And if that wasn't bad enough, later that afternoon, a fleet of trucks rolled into the neighborhood. Construction workers wearing bright orange vests unloaded equipment onto Henry's lawn. Emily ran outside, heart pounding. "What the hell is going on?" she shouted, her voice barely containing the panic rising in her chest. A burly man in a hard hat flipped through a clipboard. "We've got an order to clear the property. Says here it's an unauthorized structure on HOA land." Emily's stomach dropped. "This is private property. This is my brother's home." Then, like a villain straight out of a movie, Veronica stepped forward, sunglasses perched on her nose, clutching a thick stack of legal-looking papers. "Actually, it's HOA property now," she purred, holding up a document with Henry's name on it. "And as per Section 14.2 of our bylaws, non-compliant structures must be removed immediately." Emily snatched the paper from her hand and skimmed through it, her breath catching in her throat. Henry's house had been transferred to the HOA overnight. It was all a setup. And then, the growl of a bulldozer's engine filled the air. The workers weren't here to inspect the property. They were here to destroy it. Henry, completely unaware of what was happening outside, stepped onto the porch, his cane tapping against the wooden floor. "Emily? What's going on?" But before she could answer, before she could even process the insanity of the situation, the bulldozer lurched forward, its massive steel blade aimed directly at their front steps. Would they really demolish a blind man's house in broad daylight? On camera? You won't believe what happens next. Hit that subscribe button and stay tuned, because this story is just getting started. The bulldozer's engine roared, drowning out the frantic protest of Emily as she stood in front of it, arms spread wide. The construction crew hesitated, exchanging uncertain glances. This wasn't just another job. This was someone's home. But Veronica Blake had no patience for second thoughts. "Proceed," she ordered coldly, arms crossed as she watched from the curb. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she turned to Henry. who stood motionless on the porch, gripping his cane tightly. He couldn't see what was happening, but he could hear it. The deep rumble of machinery, the nervous murmurs of neighbors who had gathered on their lawns, the quiet defiance in Emily's breathing. "Emily, talk to me," Henry said, his voice steady despite the chaos unfolding around him. "They're going to bulldoze the house," she whispered, throat tightening. Henry exhaled slowly, his mind racing. He was a former federal judge. He knew the law inside and out. But this was something else entirely. This wasn't just illegal. It was a blatant public attack. The bulldozer lurched forward, its massive steel blade just inches from the front steps. Emily whipped around and grabbed her phone, recording everything. "This is illegal. This is private property, and you have no authority to do this." Veronica smirked. "The HOA has full authority. You should have read the fine print before moving in." That's when Henry heard it. The sound of wood splintering, concrete cracking under pressure. The bulldozer had made contact with the lower edge of the porch, nudging it just enough to send a violent vibration through the house. A shudder ran through the wooden beams. Max, Henry's guide dog, barked furiously, his instincts kicking in as he tried to pull Henry back inside. Emily turned, her eyes wild with fury. "Henry, we have to go, now!" But Henry didn't move. He gritted his teeth, squared his shoulders, and took a step forward, toward the bulldozer. Gasps rippled through the watching crowd. A blind man, standing defiantly in the path of destruction. "Stop," he commanded, his voice sharp, unwavering. It wasn't a plea. It was an order. The construction workers hesitated again. Even the driver shifted uneasily in his seat. But Veronica? She didn't waver. "Run it down," she said simply. The bulldozer revved louder, inching forward, a 6-ton monster preparing to erase a man from his own property. Then, a scream from across the street. "Stop! Stop! For God's sake!" It was Mrs. Rodriguez, an elderly neighbor, phone clenched in her hands, trembling with fury. "I just called the news," she cried. "And the police. This is being recorded live." Veronica froze. For the first time, doubt flickered across her perfectly composed face. The moment Mrs. Rodriguez's words rang out, everything shifted. The tension that had held the neighborhood in a silent chokehold finally cracked, replaced by a ripple of hushed voices, rustling curtains, and the unmistakable glow of camera lights. Veronica Blake's smirk faltered, but she quickly recovered. "I don't care who's watching," she snapped, turning sharply toward the bulldozer operator. "Do your job. Now." The man in the cab hesitated. His knuckles tightened on the levers. The engine hummed louder, but he didn't move. The weight of dozens of eyes pressed down on him. Henry stood his ground, cane planted firmly. His home, his rights, his dignity. None of it would be crushed today. Emily stepped forward, voice shaking with fury. "You go through with this, and you're going to regret it." But Veronica was beyond reason now. The power she had wielded for years, the unchecked control, the fear she had instilled, was slipping through her fingers. And she refused to lose. With a sharp glare at the operator, she yanked her phone from her pocket and dialed a number. "Fine. If you won't do it, I'll find someone who will." The neighborhood watched in stunned silence. Then, sirens. The unmistakable wail of approaching law enforcement. Emily let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. They came. Someone actually came. Flashing red and blue lights painted streaks across the pavement as 2 police cruisers screeched to a stop in front of the house. Officers emerged, hands on their belts, eyes scanning the crowd. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with Sergeant Calloway stitched into his uniform, approached Henry. "Sir, we got reports of an illegal demolition. Can you confirm?" Henry turned his head slightly toward the sound of the officer's voice. "That's correct," he said evenly. "This is my property, and they're trying to destroy it without legal grounds." Sergeant Calloway's gaze snapped to Veronica. "Ma'am, do you have a court order for this?" Veronica lifted her chin defiantly. "This is HOA jurisdiction. We don't need—" "You need a legal order to seize and demolish private property," Calloway interrupted, voice firm. "And unless you've got one, you're committing a crime." The crowd murmured louder. Cameras zoomed in. The truth was unraveling, and Veronica knew it. Emily seized the moment, holding up her phone. "I have proof. This so-called eviction notice was forged. She faked the paperwork to take our home." Calloway's eyes darkened as he took the documents from Emily, scanning them with a practiced eye. Veronica laughed, sharp, incredulous. Oh, please. You think I'd be stupid enough to… But the officer wasn't listening to her anymore. He was flipping the pages, his expression shifting from suspicion to something much colder. Then he looked up, and this time, his hand went straight to his handcuffs. Veronica Blake, you're under arrest for falsifying legal documents, property fraud, and illegal demolition attempts. The entire street erupted. Veronica Blake staggered back, her confident smirk wiped clean as the handcuffs snapped around her wrists. The entire street was silent for a beat, as if no one could believe what they had just witnessed. Then, chaos erupted. Neighbors whispered in shock, some gasped, others held up their phones, capturing every second. Henry stood motionless, his grip tightening on his cane as he processed the shift in power. For the first time since this nightmare began, Veronica wasn't the one in control. This is a mistake, Veronica hissed, her voice sharp but laced with a tinge of panic. I am the HOA president. You can't do this. Sergeant Calloway barely acknowledged her, guiding her toward the police cruiser with practiced efficiency. You're more than just a president now, Miss Blake, he said coolly. You're a suspect. Emily let out a breath of relief. But they weren't out of danger yet. The bulldozer, still idling ominously, stood like a beast waiting for orders. The operator, looking increasingly unsure, lifted his hands in surrender. I was just following instructions. Stand down, Calloway ordered. This demolition is illegal. Anyone who proceeds will be held accountable. Veronica thrashed in his grip, her polished composure cracking with each second. No, you don't understand. I did this for the community, for the property values. That house is a blight on this neighborhood. Henry, who had remained quiet throughout the exchange, lifted his head slightly, turning in Veronica's direction. His face was unreadable, but his voice, steady, calm, and firm, cut through the air like steel. You mean my house? My home? Veronica's mouth snapped shut. My entire life was inside that house, Henry continued, each word deliberate. And you were willing to destroy it, to rip it away from me. Not because it was a blight, but because you thought you could. The weight of his words hung thick in the air. Even the crowd, many of whom had previously feared Veronica's wrath, shifted uncomfortably. Then, a voice from the crowd. She fined me for having my Christmas lights up too long. Another. She made my grandpa tear down his wheelchair ramp. More voices joined in, a tidal wave of confessions and grievances. It was as if years of fear and frustration had finally boiled over. Sergeant Calloway turned to his fellow officers. We'll need statements from everyone. Looks like we're uncovering more than just fraud. As Veronica was shoved into the police car, her face twisted in fury, but there was something else. Fear. Fear of losing the power she had clung to for so long. Henry tilted his head toward Emily. What do you see? Emily, staring at the wreckage of their porch, the destruction that had almost been so much worse, swallowed hard. I see the end of an era, she whispered, and the beginning of something bigger. The police cruiser's door slammed shut, muffling Veronica Blake's furious protests. She jerked against the cuffs, twisting in the seat as though sheer willpower could undo the mess she had created. But the law wasn't hers to manipulate anymore. Emily stood next to Henry, her fingers still trembling from the adrenaline, her mind reeling from everything that had just happened. The once pristine neighborhood of Silver Pines was a war zone of whispers and cell phones, neighbors watching the fall of the most feared woman in their community. But Henry? He remained unshaken. She's not done, he murmured, tilting his head slightly as if listening beyond the chaos. Emily turned to him, eyebrows furrowing. Henry, she's in the back of a cop car. She's done. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, his fingers tightened around his cane, his jaw locking as though he could feel something coming that no one else could. Then, the sound of tires screeching against asphalt. A black luxury SUV came tearing around the corner, its tinted windows reflecting the flashing blue and red lights. It skidded to a stop just feet from the police cars, the driver's door flinging open before the vehicle had even fully stopped. A man stepped out, tall, sharp-suited, and radiating entitlement. His jaw was tight, his expensive watch glinting under the streetlights as he stormed toward the scene. Emily's stomach dropped instantly. Nathaniel Blake, Veronica's son. Unlike his mother, Nathaniel operated in the shadows, a real estate mogul with more lawyers on retainer than most people had contacts in their phones. His specialty? Making problems disappear. "You've made a very, very big mistake," he said coldly, his icy blue gaze locking onto Sergeant Calloway. The sergeant didn't blink. "And you are?" "Nathaniel Blake." His voice was smooth as silk, sharp as a dagger. "My mother is a respected figure in this community. I suggest you release her before this turns into a lawsuit you can't afford." Henry tilted his head slightly toward the sound of Nathaniel's voice. Then, without hesitation, he spoke. "Your mother forged legal documents. That's a felony." Nathaniel's smile didn't waver, but something in his eyes flickered, an almost imperceptible sign of irritation. "And who are you, exactly?" Henry stepped forward, his presence alone commanding the space. "Henry Lawson," he said, his tone cool and measured. "Former federal judge." The shift was instantaneous. Nathaniel went completely still, his mask of arrogance cracking just for a second. Recognition flashed in his eyes. He knew exactly who Henry was. And for the first time that night, Veronica stopped struggling in the back of the police car. Because they had underestimated him. They had thought they were ruining the life of just another helpless man. But they had picked the wrong target. Nathaniel Blake's jaw tightened, his confidence flickering for just a second before he forced a smirk back onto his face. The man had spent years negotiating multi-million-dollar real estate deals, outmaneuvering attorneys and dodging regulations. But this was different. He had walked into this fight thinking his mother was dealing with some helpless blind man who didn't know the first thing about the law. Instead, she had just bulldozed the home of a former federal judge. And now, the whole world was watching. Nathaniel's fingers curled into fists at his sides before he shoved them into the pockets of his designer suit. He needed to regain control, fast. "Judge Lawson," he said smoothly, his tone shifting from arrogance to strategic charm, "I respect your service, and I'm sure this is all just a big misunderstanding." Henry didn't flinch. "It's not." Nathaniel's nostrils flared slightly. He wasn't used to people not bending. "I'd be happy to sort this out privately," he continued, voice lower, more persuasive. "I have a legal team that can—" "I'm sure you do," Henry interrupted. "But the thing about the law, Mr. Blake, is that it doesn't operate on private deals." Nathaniel's patience visibly thinned. He turned back to Sergeant Calloway, forcing a chuckle. "Come on, officer," he said, stepping closer. "My mother is the HOA president. She was just enforcing the bylaws. If you charge her for that, you'd have to arrest every HOA president in the country." Calloway didn't even blink. "She committed fraud, Mr. Blake. That's a felony in every state in the country." Nathaniel's fake grin dropped entirely. His hand twitched as if he wanted to grab his phone, call someone, fix this. But there was nothing to fix, because it wasn't just the cops anymore. It was the news crews now parked at the end of the street. It was the neighbors holding up their phones, recording every word. It was the legal team Henry's sister had just called, now en route with damning evidence. Veronica finally snapped. "Nathaniel, do something!" she shrieked from inside the police cruiser, her usual icy composure completely shattered. "Fix this! Get me out of here!" Nathaniel took a sharp breath before turning to face her. But before he could open his mouth, Henry spoke again, low, controlled, and devastatingly calm. "She's not getting out of this," he said. "And neither are you." Nathaniel froze, his sharp blue eyes narrowing slightly. "I know what you've been doing," Henry continued. "The fraud, the backdoor property seizures, the intimidation tactics. Your mother might be the one in handcuffs right now, but you're just as guilty." For the first time, genuine unease crossed Nathaniel's face. Because Henry wasn't bluffing. And if he had proof, then this wasn't just about saving his mother anymore. It was about saving himself. Nathaniel stared at Henry, the sharp lines of his carefully curated persona beginning to crack. He prided himself on staying ahead, on being untouchable. But right now, he was losing. His mind raced through every possible escape route. Could he buy time? Could he pull a few strings, call in a favor? But no, not with cameras rolling, not with his mother already in cuffs. And then Henry delivered the final blow. "I assume you know what RICO charges are, Mr. Blake?" Nathaniel's face went pale. Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. The law designed to take down entire crime rings. Henry tilted his head slightly, as if listening for Nathaniel's next move. Because after reviewing your mother's financial records, it appears your little HOA empire fits the criteria. A hush fell over the street. Even the officers exchanged glances. RICO charges? That was serious? That wasn't just a fine, that was federal prison? Nathaniel swallowed hard. He knew Henry wasn't bluffing. He had evidence. And just like that, the game was over. Nathaniel turned sharply on his heel, not sparing his mother a single glance as he strode back to his SUV, yanked open the door, and sped away without another word. Veronica's scream of betrayal echoed through the night as the cruiser door slammed shut once more, locking her inside. Henry sighed, adjusting his cane. "Well," he murmured, "that went well." Emily let out a shaky breath before bursting into laughter, her adrenaline finally spilling over. "You just took down an entire corrupt HOA empire in one night." Henry smiled faintly. "I had a good team." And as they stood there, watching the police escort Veronica away, neighbors began cheering. One by one, people stepped forward, shaking Henry's hand, hugging Emily, and vowing that Silver Pines would never be ruled by fear again. This wasn't just one family's victory. It was an entire community's redemption. What should Henry do next? Should he push for criminal charges against Nathaniel? Or should he focus on rebuilding Silver Pines into the fair, welcoming neighborhood it was meant to be? Comment below and tell me what you think. And if you loved seeing Veronica and her corrupt empire crumble, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because I have more insane HOA horror stories coming your way. Let's hear it. What's the worst HOA story you've ever heard? Drop it in the comments.